before we get started, how many of you here have purchased a Bitcoin before? Great. And how many of you have used it for anything? Great. So it will be a great learning experience for everyone else. With that, I just want to, let everyone introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Elise Colleen?
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today. My name's Elise Colleen. I'm on the investment team of Clearstone Venture Partners and March Capital Partners, which is a new fund that's evolved from Clearstone, a $300 to $400 million fund that's aiming to be LA's largest and most aggressive venture capital firm. So, and Clearstone has been very involved with TIE, so it's even more of a pleasure to be here after hearing such great things about the group. I've been there for 3 years, and we're broadly focused on investing in technology innovation from Series A to pre-IPO.
Hi, my name is Nick Tomeno, and I'm Business Development Manager at Coinbase. Coinbase, our kind of mission as a company is to bring Bitcoin into the mainstream. So we make it really easy for both consumers and merchants to use Bitcoin. We're kind of the go-to place in the US for an individual to link their bank account and buy Bitcoin, and we also have an API and a set of tools that make it easy for merchants to accept Bitcoin. I've been with the company for 10 months, started when we were at 9 employees, and now we're at 45 and rapidly growing. So excited to be here and talk with you guys about Bitcoin.
I'm Max Sorenko. I'm part of DFJ Growth. We are fairly well known across the Valley for investing in disruptive enabling technologies, Bitcoin being one of them at the early stage. We have not invested in anything from the later stage yet, but we are watching the markets quite a bit and seeing a lot of opportunity there. So I would love to talk a bit more about it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Sullivan, and I'm the founder of ChangeTip. ChangeTip allows you to send Bitcoins over social networks. So we're trying to make it easy for people to use Bitcoin for something realistic rather than just buy alpaca socks. We'd love to reduce the barriers and reduce the friction around Bitcoin to something as simple as sending a tweet. I also am a 500 Startups mentor, and I also run a Bitcoin syndicate with Gil Pinchina on AngelList.
So thank you very much. I wanted the format to be very informal, such that it could be more of a conversation. It's a new topic. Everyone's really excited to learn more. But I want to know why you're all excited. If you can spend 30 seconds or so talking about when was the first time you heard of something called Bitcoin or digital currency, and then why are you here? Why did you want to go head in first to be in the space?
So I became aware of Bitcoin kind of through the hype that existed around it and began as a pessimist on the space. So I think that because there was so much hype, it almost seemed as though perhaps there wasn't true value. But in looking and doing a dive onto the tech and computer science innovation that is the blockchain, it became profoundly interesting. And what sustains my interest and catalyzed early interest beyond the computer science innovation is application in emerging markets and ability to give financial access to folks that are or underbanked, both domestically and in emerging countries.
So my background, I was in venture capital before Coinbase, and I kind of came across Bitcoin probably 3 years ago, and it kind of piqued my interest, but wasn't convinced, and generally, the types of people that were using it, the types of companies weren't compelling. I ended up going to business school, and I was at business school last year on the East Coast, and While at business school, I connected with the founders of Coinbase, Brian and Fred, and they were kind of the first legitimate founders that I had come across in this space and building a great product and really doing things the right way. And what kind of excited me when talking to them about Bitcoin is it's the first open platform for innovation in financial services that's ever existed. So if you think about the history of financial services, it's been controlled by banks and payment networks, and that fact has stifled innovation. And if you think about Bitcoin, it's an open payment network that anyone with an internet connection can connect to and build a financial services application around it. So that kind of is what excites me still most about Bitcoin, is this fact that it's enabling permissionless innovation in financial services for the first time ever. And I think, we're still in the early days of that and people realizing that, but, as entrepreneurs continue to build on the platform, we're going to see more really interesting use cases.
So I found out about Bitcoin back in college, was doing economics and computer science, so this was a very natural thing for me to get interested in. And what I really got excited about Bitcoin is that it got around the transaction fees, this 2% that's a tax and a drag on the entire global economy. And if you can remove that, you can make the world just that much more productive and accessible to everyone. And also, if you go one step beyond that, there's a lot of applications that were not possible up until now with higher transaction fees. If you drop those, you can suddenly pay 1 to 2 cents for reading a news article. You can end up appending industries like advertising with it. So I'll pass it off to the guy who's doing it.
Well, for Nick.
Yeah, actually, you steal a little of my thunder there, but I think I've got more, so it's okay. So I got excited about Bitcoin last August. I'm kind of an optimization guy, so I saw the price differentials between the US-based exchanges and Mt. Gox, and found kind of a business hack to do riskless arbitrage and ran a bunch of money through that. It was a lot of fun. I'm at least partially responsible for the downfall of Mt. Gox. So that actually just threw me into this space. I'm a pretty obsessive person. I got really into it. I got onto Reddit/r/Bitcoin every day, read the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper, fully entrenched myself in the ecosystem. And one of the key things that I got out of the white paper was the distribution of trust. The blockchain was a revolutionary technology, not only because of some of the interesting technology problems that it solved with a distributed hash table, but this idea that you could have trust through verification and trust through math rather than trust through reputation, which is what we've relied upon up until now in society for verifying a transaction. And so by taking the third party out of that equation and removing that choke point of control and allowing for direct peer-to-peer transactions, it gets real interesting when you start to think about all the possibilities and the upending, to use your words, that's going to enable. That's why I'm excited about Bitcoin, the protocol. I'm a disruptor and I like all the things that it's going to be able to disrupt. What I'm excited about for its first application is micropayments, and that's kind of my world. So I think we're going to talk a little bit more later, but that's what's got me excited.
Why don't you talk about micropayments and, I had some other topics in mind, but go for it.
Sure. So micropayments.
And then also talk about why you think it's exciting and possible today.
Sure. So micropayments have been talked about since, I keep saying the 90s. You were saying 85 earlier. I need to go read that book. But for a long time, I found a W3C spec back in 1999 that has been since abandoned, that was centered around embedding HTML tags into HTML that would allow people to charge by the minute for reading, say, the New York Times. That was where they were going with this. Obviously, that didn't pan out. I think one of the reasons that it didn't pan out was there wasn't an efficient payment mechanism. And when I talk about efficient or frictionless, I'm not just talking about the fees, because notably transaction fees are very low with Bitcoin, but also the fact that there needed to be an intermediary. There's friction from a user experience perspective. Nobody wants, when they're reading a Facebook page and they want to be able to send money to their friends, to go to another site and enter credit card information. They don't want to break flow. So there's a user experience challenge with friction. And then there's also a time-based friction challenge, just how long most of these transfers take, whether it be hours, minutes, and days, in the cases of cross-border remittances to offshore workers. So I think Bitcoin has a lot of those pieces solved, and I think we're going to finally see the realities of micropayments. I can get a little crazy about some of them. You touched on one of them, which was disrupting the online advertising ecosystem. Right now, we've lazily accepted that ads are the right way to monetize content, but the real value chain is the people producing the content and the people consuming the content, and we just don't have an efficient way for those people to get paid. So I think micropayments can enable that.
An interesting point about micropayments in the content space is that it also, I think, gets around the friction of mental transaction. And that had been talked about as a barrier to micropayments in the past, and was why services are generally bundled rather than priced individually when there's multiple services that are being consumed, is because mental accounting is a tax that people will normally pay to avoid. And something that's been, and I'm a user of Nick's company, ChangeTip, and I think something that they've been smarter about than other folks is thinking about the UI and UX experience that they can create to kind of to get around the mental tax that's imposed by microtransactions. So that's something perhaps you can do in the content space, and Nick has done in the content space, that hopefully others are thinking about in microtransactions in other spaces.
Yeah, if we reduce our friction around payments low enough that even the cheapest people or the laziest of people are willing to do it, then I think we'll start to see just overall the flow of money around the globe increase.
And you don't think PayPal's going to get there?
Good controversial question. They'll get there if they buy me. How's that?
I think it's important to realize that PayPal on the existing rails that they use can't, because the fees associated with the networks that they use are too high. If you think about every transaction that is sent online, there's generally a between 15 and 30 cent cost associated with that transaction. So it's not feasible to send a 10-cent tip on the existing, rails. And so that's at Coinbase. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about what are kind of new behaviors that Bitcoin can enable that the existing rail simply can't. And micropayments is one of them, because of the cost associated with the existing rails. So it's important to realize that, I think.
Very cool. Is this working? Oh, yeah, it's working. Just to add, by the way, I want to give all these folks credit. They brought me to speed with the space, from the deck Max and put together to the original paper and conversation we had to like giving me alternate use of blockchain. That Nick and we had a long conversation that afternoon, and I wish I knew you sooner.
It's okay.
But
We'll talk later.
I'm going to ask them really tough questions based on everything they've taught me. So, I've heard two sets of folks talk about, this compared to the internet, for example, the early stages of TCP/IP, and talked about how there's still like 10, 15 years of technology and innovation that needs to come together before, digital currency generally can be adopted. And then there are others who are just talking about like, we're like a couple years out. Where do you all stand?
I think it's tough to say. If you look at from a sheer numbers perspective, the user base that's using Bitcoin right now is still extremely small, much smaller than you might think given the media coverage that Bitcoin gets. So on Coinbase, for example, we have 1.6 million consumer wallets and 36,000 merchants using Coinbase. It's estimated that there's between 5 and 10 million, depending on who you ask, Bitcoin users worldwide. And those numbers are growing rapidly, up something like 15x year over year, but still very small. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of innovation and entrepreneurs building solutions that give real use cases for consumers. So I think it's tough to say where, when this is going to reach mainstream adoption, but it is a fairly small user base still. So.
Yeah, at DFJ, we tend to think of this as still clearly in the early adopter phase of the technology life cycle. We feel that the international use cases, like remittances and money transfers, will be easier in the short term because there's not quite as much of a financial system developed in emerging markets. So we think that in the next 2 or 3 years, it'll start breaking mainstream like M-Pesa did. Afterwards, I think in about 3 to 5 years, it might start coming over to the US. But the important part there is that we need a real big killer consumer app in order to get the consumer adoption going. Nick here is working on it, and Coinbase is working on the merchant side of things, but it'll take a while yet, a few more years, before it breaks mainstream.
So I think, to jump in, the killer application in emerging markets is access to, a financial system. So I think that there certainly are like very profound reasons to use Bitcoin now. And I think one thing holding kind of gating use is the UI UX experience, as was the case in early internet, is the case in Bitcoin, is very, very rough. And so there's exceptions of companies that it's not rough, but as that improves and there's more attention on the front end, I think that the barrier to entry into the community is lowered.
Right. So I think I'd agree with everybody that it's early. One thing that I have seen, though, is it seems to be moving much faster. I was at a Bitcoin conference in December, and the room was made up of half the Bitcoin crowd, and that can be subdivided further into the crypto math nerds, the the Federal Reserve Bank anarchists, and then the privacy freaks / criminals that didn't want their purchases tracked. That was the original makeup of the geek half of the room, and then the other half of the room was clueless venture capitalists who knew they needed to do something with Bitcoin, and they were desperately trying to figure out what they were supposed to be doing. Fast forward.
Present company excluded, I'm presuming.
Huh?
Present company excluded.
Always. Were you at Inside Bitcoins in December? No, okay, good. So then fast forward a few months, and I saw a radical shift in just the makeup of the room and the conferences and the ecosystem overall. What started happening is we started getting much more respectable entrepreneurs. We started getting more fundable companies. We started getting lots of financial infrastructure guys, either Wall Street, the more classic fintech crowd who knew what they were doing and weren't building crypto cool wallets anymore, but they were actually building infrastructure. So, and that was in the span of 4 months. So yes, it's still immature, but I'm seeing that there's some technology accelerators that are moving it faster than we saw with, say, the internet. To talk a little bit more about the emerging markets, I couldn't agree more. I spent a lot of time in the Philippines recently, and 10% of their GDP comes from remittances. And Coins.ph is being run by a founder there named Ron Hose. Ron Hose created TalkBox here in San Francisco, sold to Telefonica for $240 million. Then he read Eric Schmidt's Innovation Endeavors, which is his personal investment arm. So this is a top quality founder, and this is what he's decided to do, is build a Bitcoin wallet company in the Philippines. And what I've seen from him that's really impressive is he's got the best last mile infrastructure that I've ever seen, in that you can send Bitcoin to the Philippines and then go cash it out at a 7-Eleven. He's got that last bit. So all of the promises of the biggest single pain point that I think that Bitcoin solves today is cross-border remittances. The rest I think are going to be large, especially for people here in the U.S., because we're very spoiled with the financial infrastructure that we have here. But it's still a big pain outside the U.S. So I do think that's going to be a good initial launch point, both here and in Mexico and Latin America. I'm sorry, Southeast Asia and Latin America.
Just so you know, 40% or maybe more of Americans are unbanked. So we may be spoiled, but it's not, 100% of the population even here. And I think the founder of Zappo described this as one of the parallel to what landline and a telephone, like a cell phone. He said something like, when landline was new, 6 million people had it, but then when cell phone came around, 6 billion people had it. So I think he said that Bitcoin is similar to what about the same numbers with how many people have bank accounts today to versus how many we'll have in the future. So that's a very big market, but that's just what I thought I'd throw in there. But were you going to say something, or one of you?
I actually had a little bit more on that. So, sorry. Is that all right? Did you have more to add?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. So, along with developing that last mile infrastructure, the bet that Ron's actually making and that others in Latin America are making is that 80% of the country-ish doesn't have a bank right now. 5% only has a credit card. The bet is that they'll leapfrog over banks and credit cards and go straight to a digital currency for payments. And I think that's where the real opportunity lies in these emerging markets.
Absolutely. So I think I really appreciate your point, and and it sounds very true. I think that the way I look at the opportunity is that we get to 1 billion users of Bitcoin before we get to 20% penetration domestically. And I think that's because the use case, as I said before, is just more pronounced and apparent and urgent in emerging markets.
Very cool. So I've heard remittances. What else? I've heard, being able to bank, generally just in an international market. Do you see, the person earning $3 a day somewhere in Argentina, getting the salary in digital currency and storing it, and then using it for, so to avoid in-country risk, inflation, whatever that is, or is that a dream? Pipe dream?
No, I think that's already happening. I mean, it's tough for consumers in the U.S. To think of Bitcoin as a store of value because we have the dollar, which is not that volatile. You can keep it in a bank account and it's fully insured. But when you think about people in countries across the world like Argentina who don't trust their governments, their currency, the Argentinian peso, has depreciated roughly 10% year over year for the past 10 years. Bitcoin becomes very interesting as a store of value. And we're starting to see that in countries across the world. The challenge in a country like Argentina, while it's very interesting to consumers, it's tougher for entrepreneurs there because of regulatory challenges, and it's tougher to get a banking relationship. And so there's trade-offs. But generally, definitely in different countries across the world that would rather store their value in a currency based on math rather than based on people. Bitcoin is very interesting.
I mean, absolutely, the international issue, like I said, is probably the first one that's going to happen. But it's not to take away from the broader view of removing the 2% transaction cost that your credit card processor makes a merchant pay every single time. The merchants here in the US have already valued that. Dell is willing to, for a short time, give a 10% discount on its PCs just to train people to buy on Bitcoin so they can get 2% of their revenue to go directly to their bottom line. If you think about low margin industries where the bottom line might be 3 to 5%, if you can remove that 2% barrier, you're almost doubling your profits. So long term, I think there is a big, big opportunity here. The question is, how do you seed it properly with the consumer?
Just to be a little more argumentative to make it fun. Bitcoin got a lot of things right. I'm one of the bigger zealots in the industry. From a commerce/transaction perspective, I think it got a few things wrong. The fact that it's modeled more off of gold and it's a commodity, and that's attracting a lot of speculators. It's deflationary over time. Doesn't make it real suitable for some transactions, like say a 30-year mortgage, where you'd have to pay back a lot more by the time that it matured. The e-commerce transaction, of course, the merchants love it, but defending the perspective of a consumer for a minute, I take great comfort in the fact that I could buy something with my Visa or my MasterCard on a particularly sketchy site and not even think twice about it, because I know that if there's anything wrong with that transaction, if I don't get what I paid for, Visa's got my back. And that is part of what people are paying for when they pay that, or what merchants are paying for when they pay that 2% fee. So I do think that we need to figure out as an industry what some solutions are for solving some of the remaining problems that Bitcoin has yet to solve that, quite frankly, the credit card companies have already solved.
So that brings us to a good next topic. What needs, you talked about the last mile. What needs to, be invented before this gets massively adopted by the youth consumers? Is it the wallets? There are a bunch of wallets out there now. Is it, some education? What is it for people to actually start using their Bitcoin?
I think one of the most important things is that the benefits of Bitcoin for consumers in the U.S. need to become more clear. And there are benefits right now, and I think the benefits are going to improve as innovation occurs. But generally, one of the big ones is discounts, which Max referred to, where merchants right now are rapidly adopting, and merchant adoption is happening in the U.S. quicker because when a merchant uses Bitcoin, they save generally 6 to 8%. And merchants like Dell and Overstock and many others are already starting to pass some of those savings on to consumers, where if you go to Dell for a limited time and use Bitcoin, you can get 10% off your purchase. And so as this continues to happen, I think consumers are going to realize that a benefit to using Bitcoin is getting some cost savings. Another big one, I think, is the financial privacy associated with using Bitcoin. So when you use your credit card, you're giving up a lot of personally identifiable information and payment credentials, which can be used by a hacker. So, two of the big cases in the past year have been Target and Home Depot, right, where their systems were hacked, millions of users' information was exposed. Fundamentally, that's not possible with Bitcoin because when you make a Bitcoin payment, you're not giving your personally identifiable information or payment credentials. And so for consumers that really value financial privacy, Bitcoin is much better than existing alternatives. And so as I think that resonates more with consumers, Bitcoin for U.S. consumers is going to become more interesting as well. And then the last one is kind of the new behaviors that I think that Bitcoin enables. And we've talked about that with micropayments and cross-border crowdfunding and remittances, as many others. But that's kind of, to me, that's most important in the U.S. right now, is for the benefits of consumers to be more clear.
Yeah, in general, I would say on the consumer side, so far the killer apps, so to speak, have been speculating that the currency will go up farther and buying and selling drugs on Silk Road. Both of those, as of late, have become less attractive. So we're really looking for a new way to get consumers to find a reason to buy the product. yes, discounting works with some situations. However, it really takes a 5% difference in price to get any consumer to actually buy into something. So I think the merchants will either have to move to do temporary, even higher decreases in price in order to train their users to use Bitcoin, or go into something like loyalty points or airline miles or something similar, where you're getting something else instead of just cash back, which you might not think the cash back is quite that much. In terms of anonymity, I would actually disagree a bit in that Bitcoin is pseudonymous, not anonymous. Every transaction is actually recorded on the blockchain. So it is theoretically possible that through some advances in computer science, you'll be able to de-anonymize these transactions. That said, I really do agree that the personally identifiable information, aka your credit card number, cannot be stolen if you use proper, well, if you're not stupid about it, and that no one can charge from your account by simply like, oh, I have your credit card, I memorized the number, I will try to steal away from there.
So I think everybody knows my answer is micropayments. So I'll talk about a different one. Continuing down the last mile path, though, payroll companies. There's actually a pretty interesting company going through, I think it's Boost, one of the accelerators right now, called Bitwage, that's an add-on to existing payroll services, and it makes it so that employees can get payroll. And at first, when I heard it, it actually sounded a little bit silly because it just sounded like more friction for the average person. But then they started talking about some real interesting ideas around real-time payroll. If you think about back to the friction and the costs, why do we actually pay people after 2 weeks? Why couldn't we pay them at the end of the day? Or actually one of the good examples that I came up with was an Uber driver. Oftentimes, an Uber driver is paying out of pocket for gas and then has to wait for 2 weeks to get his payment. If he could, at the end of the night, every night, he could see, oh, I earned this much and it's in my account. Reducing friction around transaction fees enables some interesting things if you started to go down Bitcoin payroll. I think it's these kinds of things that we'll have to show and build the pathways for and the infrastructure for the average person, in addition to purchases and commerce and cool use cases like tipping and microtransactions. But also just show them the benefit of using Bitcoin as their primary currency.
I wanted to unpack the statement a little bit, or the idea of Silk Road a bit, because I think that it actually represents a great use case. So not in the sense of purchasing drugs, but in the sense of being able to make a purchase without being prohibited from that. And that becomes interesting when you look at what the e-commerce market looks like now. So in the US, we can purchase online and we have access to Overstock or to eBay and a variety, any e-commerce site we could want to purchase from, but that's not the case as financial institutions regulate where you can accept transactions from and how you can accept them. So what Bitcoin is great at is that it allows you to send money to who you want. So you can be perhaps held accountable for what you spend money on, which is what we saw happen with Silk Road, but you can't be prohibited from that. So something the Bitcoin community really latched onto was the donations to LikiWeeks site, which PayPal stopped or prohibited from happening. So you were not allowed to donate, although it wasn't illegal to donate. You couldn't use your credit card to donate. You couldn't use PayPal. And presuming that we want to have a more open and inclusive global marketplace where your geography doesn't prohibit you access, and where we're allowed to make our own consumption decisions outside of regulation, then Bitcoin is just a killer application. So you can be in Eastern Europe and still make a purchase from Overstock, assuming that shipment can get to you, because credit card companies can't assign you to a higher risk category and not process your transaction. And Silk Road was a proof of that.
Very cool. So is Bitcoin the leader of digital currency, or, I mean, there's been a lot of fluctuation. The price is now like close to 400 now. At one point, it was like 650, and I think there was talk that that was a stable price. Where do you guys think?
What about Nick? Do you know much about the pegged digital currency to the U.S. dollar? Do you have
talking about
thoughts about that?
Brock's
We haven't
real
talked
coin?
about it. Yeah, we haven't talked about it, and not specifically his, but just the idea of it.
I don't know very much about that actually.
So there's some folks working on a digital currency that would be pegged to fiat currency. So potential, and it could be any fiat currency, but a digital representation of USD so that price fluctuation would be a non-issue. And so potentially that's something. That's interesting because A, the main use case isn't for speculatory purposes, and B, it allows you to participate in the ecosystem without having to hedge against it or be diversified against fluctuation.
Yeah, I would say that Bitcoin was first. Bitcoin was not the best currency out there. Has a lot of flaws. That said, it has such a network effect and such name recognition that'll be very difficult for any of the other cryptocurrencies to match it. I mean, Ripple and Ethereum, I think, are very interesting solutions, but with so much investment already in Bitcoin, both mental and monetary, it'll be a bit like different processors versus the x86. Yes, x86 had a lot of flaws. Yes, we're still dealing with the architectural flaws today, but it worked. It worked well. It got adoption, and that was enough to build a network effect, which is very difficult to take over.
So first on the volatility, I to be honest, dismiss volatility because it's just inversely correlated with volume. So it's a short-term problem. I'm glad to hear that Realcoin will solve it, but it's not something that I personally pay attention to. On the infrastructure side, I used to say, okay, if we map out and agree that we're at 1994 with the Bitcoin ecosystem, I look at what we've got with Bitcoin 1.0 as Netscape 1.0. And, we had Internet Explorer come along, we had Firefox, and now Chrome. My big bet is on digital currencies more broadly. I'm not sure that Bitcoin is the winner. I used to say that about 6 months ago, and now I tilt towards the amount of infrastructure and inertia that Bitcoin has. It would be, you can't just be 20% better. You can't even be twice as good as Bitcoin. Something would have to come along and be 10 times better than Bitcoin to unseat where we're at today.
I agree with most of what's been said. We get asked at Coinbase all the time, when are we going to accept Dogecoin? When are we going to accept Litecoin? Our lead developer, Charlie Lee, was the founder of Litecoin, which I think last time I checked is the second largest altcoin by market value. But we believe right now that Bitcoin is so significantly in the lead and has such a great network effect that for us to add another currency would confuse consumers. And Bitcoin, when you think about bringing digital currency to the mainstream, it's already confusing enough to a mainstream consumer. So for us to add a Litecoin or a Dogecoin, and then consumers go to our site and have multiple choices, makes things even more confusing. So we're definitely open to learning about what's going on in the ecosystem. We follow it closely. Different projects, particularly interesting is what's going on with side chains. But we generally are very committed and focused on Bitcoin.
So I'll geek out for a minute on sidechains. Sidechains is one of the big problems right now with the Bitcoin development ecosystem is that they're effectively at a standstill. They're terrified of making any changes because they don't have a staging environment. They don't have a way, there's testnet, but there's no way that they can roll something out. And so everybody's real scared, especially of any significant changes. They'll make minor tweaks here and there. So that's why the overall development velocity of Bitcoin has slowed down. So sidechains is one of the big goals of the team. And what that's going to allow for is a rules rules-based system for a different version or a different flavor of the currency to exist within the main Bitcoin infrastructure, so that you can do not only incremental versions and releases of new ideas within Bitcoin, but then also develop full-fledged altcoins within a sidechain. So that actually makes it so that altcoins are going to be that much more difficult to get off the ground, because the first reaction that everybody's going to have is, well, that's great, but do it as a side chain instead. So you're still going to be using the underlying Bitcoin infrastructure for everything.
The reason why that would be an exciting development, in my opinion, is because there's certain characteristics or parameters of the coin that make it less feasible for certain types of transactions. So it's 10 minutes on average to process a Bitcoin transaction, and perhaps, or not perhaps, but likely there's coins that are much better at doing quick transactions, like going to Starbucks and purchasing coffee. Sidechains would allow that coin to be pegged to Bitcoin and continue to add value to the ecosystem.
So how does Coinbase look at that 10-minute transaction with the retailers?
Yeah, so one thing important to know about Coinbase is that we enable off-blockchain transactions, which are truly instant and irreversible, where an on-blockchain transaction waits 10 minutes to get one confirmation, and many merchant processors actually wait up to 60 minutes to get 6 confirmations to approve a transaction. So the off-blockchain capability that we offer is something unique, and we also, even for on-blockchain, this is a little nuanced, but we have an in-house node which we use to propagate a transaction throughout the network. And within 1 to 2 seconds, we know with a high degree of probability whether that transaction is likely to get accepted on the blockchain. And so even for on-blockchain transactions, a merchant will know whether it's good or not in 1 to 2 seconds. So for us, that the blockchain delay is not a major issue.
So we've built an off-chain ledger as well for change tips, so that tips are free and instant. But just to talk about why that's important, and further add to some of the shortcomings of Bitcoin, the idea of doing microtransactions directly on the chain, it works, but there's the time that it takes, number one, and then one of the dirty little secrets of Bitcoin right now is that there's a max of 7 transactions per second across the whole network. So if we really start to talk about how this could scale to Visa or credit card processing volume, which is somewhere around 2,000 or 3,000 transactions a second, there's going to have to be a lot of improvements made. So as a result, companies that are expecting to do high transactions within the Bitcoin ecosystem have learned to build off-chain ledgers so that they're touching the blockchain as little as they can. The analogy I use is if you were building a gambling site, you wouldn't have a transaction for every blackjack hand. You would just have one when they sat down at the table and when they left the table. And we're all building that kind of infrastructure right now because of some inherent limitations of the blockchain.
There's also a transaction fee associated with transactions, which is roughly, I think last time I checked, 8 cents. So to do a 15-cent transaction on blockchain right now doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. So that's why off-blockchain transactions are really important.
It's actually about a half a penny now.
Yeah? Okay.
It used to be around 8 cents, but
Okay.
they cut it down.
Okay.
So for off the blockchain transactions, does there need to be any infrastructure set up for that? Insurance companies, things, securities to, I don't know, that just adds another whole spectrum of things that I would want to.
Yeah, so it's a good point. I mean, one of the things that people love about Bitcoin is that it's a distributed ledger that everyone can see and has access to. When you're taking things off the blockchain, you become the trusted third party that is controlling keys and verifying transactions. And we believe that while we do love the open nature of Bitcoin, we believe that in order to take it to the mainstream, there does need to be a trusted third party who's verifying transactions and holding public keys and making Bitcoin easy to use. And so Coinbase is that brand. And So security is a huge focus for us, obviously, as well as insurance. And we're continuing to, improve on both fronts, but definitely those are primary focuses for our business.
Cool. Just to add to that, I think, and you can tell me, I've heard that even though all the retailers are accepting Bitcoin, barely even 1% of the transaction is gone through using that currency. What needs to change again? I know I bring it back to that. What needs to change to make that work?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. We have merchants using our tools that are doing 30% of total revenue in Bitcoin. But generally, particularly the brand name merchants that are accepting, the Dells, the Dish Networks, the Overstocks, are doing 2% or less. And I think it goes back to the consumer benefits. The consumer benefits need to be more clear and I think this will happen over time. As the benefits become more clear, as Bitcoin becomes easier to use, as the volatility comes down, all these things will, I think, drive consumer adoption. Right now, the consumers that are using Bitcoin are really passionate about Bitcoin. And that's really the benefit and why big merchants are accepting, right? It's not necessarily the cost savings, because the cost saving, when you think about it, less than 1% of total revenue is going to be in Bitcoin. That doesn't really move the needle. But for companies like Overstock and Dell, the ability to get thousands of new customers from a passionate and loyal early adopter demographic is the primary reason. So I think that gets that's a little misunderstood. It's not necessarily the cost savings right now that's driving merchant adoption. It's the really passionate user base, and that's something I think some people that are in the payment space and have seen a lot of payment solutions come and go don't really realize is that the Bitcoin user base that really believes in the values behind Bitcoin, the inclusive nature, the transparency, all that stuff. They love to use Bitcoin, and when a big merchant accepts, they're gonna continue to use it. And so I think that user base will continue to grow. But I think it's going to take a lot of the other stuff that I mentioned to get like the mainstream, consumers to use it for commerce.
Yeah, I would like to echo that last point. I mean, taking Dell for an example, it's not exactly the sexiest of companies these days. It's been 20 years since, dude, you got a Dell. So Bitcoin usually is among the younger, more tech-savvy demographic that would never have originally bought from Dell or Overstock.com. So a lot of these big names are finding that they can really get back into the image of being on the forefront of e-commerce versus an also-ran from a previous generation.
Are you going to add something to that? Okay. So help me understand. These merchants, are they taking Bitcoin or are they converting it to dollar before they accept it?
Yeah, that's another really good point. I mean, I think another reason that merchant adoption is happening much more rapidly in the U.S. compared to consumer adoption is because services like Coinbase and BitPay and others enable merchants to accept Bitcoin without worrying about any of the risks associated with the currency. So for someone like Overstock or Dell, will immediately convert the Bitcoin to dollars, locking in the exchange rate. They're not actually holding Bitcoin on their books. They're just benefiting from the efficiencies of the payment network without worrying about the risks of the currency. So on the consumer side, a consumer still needs to worry about the volatility, right? And there's no real go-to solutions that enable a consumer to just use the efficiencies of the network without worrying about the volatility. I think that's an opportunity for entrepreneurs and companies like us to create products that enable that. But that's an important point, and I think it's a big reason why merchant adoption is happening quicker in the U.S.
Do you think that, or any of you think that maybe we talk about consumer adoption so much, but maybe that we might never see that and it might just go to efficiencies directly with the system? And, a common consumer will never know that Bitcoin infrastructure was used in the back. and the banks use it to save costs, but end of the day charge you maybe not $30 for 30% for the wire transfer, but maybe like 10 or something like that? Or is that a possibility as well in this future world?
So it's interesting to think about all the technology revolutions that we've had over the last few years. Print to digital media, the recording industry to MP3 and iTunes, Hollywood, BitTorrent, and now we're up to paper cash and digital currency, and it's going to be the most awesome war we've ever seen, because the incumbents this time aren't big corporations or even big groups of corporations. We're talking about governments, banks, and ultimately the Federal Reserve Bank, which controls the U.S. Congress through a vote auction and indirectly controls the monetary policy for most of the globe. So it's going to be a long, drawn-out battle this time, but one of the lessons that we can pull from that is that the geeks always win. That any attempts to regulate it, squash it, stamp it down will be like playing a whack-a-mole. So suddenly Bitcoin is illegal in New York. Oh, okay, good. We're coming out with a new digital currency, and we're not going to call it a digital currency this time. It's got some other label that gets around all those laws. Any attempts to regulate this are going to be short term at best. And so I think it's an eventuality. I have a bet with a friend that within 10 years, a government will have a digital currency as its primary currency. I think within 50, the euro is probably going to be the second to last to fall, and then I give it 100 years for the US dollar to be the last to fall.
Those are some fighting words there, I will say. Bit back more to Shruti's question. I mean, there is a possibility that people won't know that they're using Bitcoin for this, but I'm fairly certain that anyone here who uses a website knows what HTTP is, at least in the broadest sense. So I think, yes, it'll be good if it's not as much in the limelight as the use cases, but everyone will know that this is the Bitcoin network that's doing these transactions.
Interesting.
I think it's possible, but not likely. I think more likely the currency will become less volatile. If you look at the history of Bitcoin, the volatility has come down every year, and I think as consumer adoption continues, as institutional investors get involved, the volatility, which is one of the big issues right now from a consumer perspective, will come down. And so I think it's possible, but I wouldn't bet on that.
Wanted to go back to Nick's point on the inevitability of Bitcoin winning the battle between cash currency and digital currency, and say that this is why I mentioned in my opening statement that the computer science innovation is so beautiful. So Satoshi built a distributed network where peers could interact to transact without a trusted third party, and this is the important piece. And the reason why that's important is going back to Paul Barron's design of the distributed network for internet, so that there was resiliency of the network should a node be attacked. And the existence of a hub or a node that can be attacked allows for regulation to come in and squash, but Satoshi's design was for it to be distributed nodes and peer-to-peer, and that can't be squashed. And this is how it makes sense that in 5 years, 10 years, or 100 years, that digital currency is sustainable, whereas cash currency is less stable.
Yeah, I will say that there is a possibility of it being squashed, just like there's a possibility of the internet being squashed, but you really have to invoke some North Korea-style regulations to stamp it out completely. I just don't see that happening in the developed world.
So another just backwards way to look at this is let's pretend actually we are living in a state where digital currency is the norm, and then somebody comes along and is trying to introduce paper currency. Imagine the backlash of, well, wait a minute, how are we going to make sure that people pay their taxes? There's going to be all kinds of underground economy that's going to roll throughout. We're not going to know about all these cash transactions. What about all this criminal activity that's used across the globe? We're not going to be able to track drug dealers and how they move their money around online. How are we going to handle all of the traceability and the accountability that comes with being able to set a proper monetary policy. So when you look at it from that perspective, there's actually a lot of incentive for governments to adopt digital currencies as their primary currency because of the better control that they're actually going to have over money.
Okay, let's change the focus a little bit for the end on other alternative uses for blockchain. Is that a thing? And how do you see that being leveraged in non-financial ecosystems?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me, I've been bothered to understand what Bitcoin is, because I'm not understanding any of it. Because there was a gold standard, anybody prints, it's based on the gold. Now, if I have $1, I can go to US government. What is this Bitcoin? Can you please explain this in a very simple term? Then I can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the gold and the dollar. All of those rely on the collective illusion that something inherently valueless is valuable. Gold, yes, it can be used for semiconductors, it can be used for jewelry, but the reason that it's a stable currency is that because everyone thinks that it's a stable store of value and that it will hold value over time. Same as the US dollar, which hasn't been on the gold standard for a long, long time. Which actually it's not that long. If you think about it, paper currency has only existed for what? A little more than 100 years, a little less, somewhere around that order of magnitude. Bitcoin is taking this trust not from a central entity, but from a distributed system. So essentially, you pass around, you have this distributed ledger, which is a central record of all the transactions that have happened on the ecosystem. As this ledger grows and as more transactions happen on it, it becomes a way to figure out who has money and who has the stores of value. And as it grows, you can see what transactions have happened. And therefore, the more a transaction it has, the more trust it has. So it's not centrally controlled. It is not under the influence of any one particular government. But as a collective hive mind, it has validation there.
Oh, you did a good job there. What was the last question, actually? I don't...
Is there any, right now, there is a dollar is controlled by US Treasury. And therefore, how many dollar is printed depends on who controls that, how many Bitcoins will be there, how the valuation will be, how do you convert with dollars or any other currency.
So the Satoshi Nakamoto established the rules that Bitcoin, the principles of Bitcoin, right? And one of those, he created a math-based way to distribute the money supply as opposed to a money supply based on governments, which is what we know today, right? So one of the rules associated with Bitcoin is that there's a fixed amount of Bitcoin that will ever be printed, and that's 21 million in the year 2140. So the way that the money supply is printed is through mining. You can think of miners as distributed computers from across the world that verify transactions, and their reward for verifying transactions is Bitcoin, and that's how Bitcoin is printed essentially. And so in the first 5 years, for every block reward, the reward was 50 Bitcoin, and that decreases by half every 5 years. And so there's basically rules that distribute the Bitcoin. And so when you think, I mentioned earlier, countries like Argentina and Zimbabwe that have governments that have often acted in corrupt ways and in the interest of themselves and not the people of their countries. Bitcoin is interesting to those people because the money supply is based on math rather than trust in people. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm hearing you, but I still don't have feel of it. But
All right.
anyway, I don't want to take the time.
It might be helpful to.
I think it's like, it's the best question that
Yeah.
could possibly be asked, so I don't think it's taking time. Where I come from when thinking about what Bitcoin is just, it's a sentence, which is just that it's a way for peers to interact without anyone else being involved. That's it. And the reason why that is the case is because you don't need to trust the person you interact with. So you can send money without trusting. And that's what the network is.
Suggestion. I think most people here who have come to learn about it don't quite even know how the transaction happens. So if you walk through transaction,
Yeah.
let's say something was available, in China or Africa, and those people are willing to accept Bitcoin as opposed to PayPal money. So how would, and then the person takes this and buys something useful for that person. If you describe the transaction from beginning to the end and completing loop, I think many of these questions would get answered.
I think this is a good question, but I also think it's this is a question that as Bitcoin progresses, it's not going to really need to be answered. Because if you think about the early days of the internet, right, there was a lot of questions around how it worked. Today, how many people in this room really know how the internet works, the nuts and bolts behind the internet? A few, but not many. So most important is that it's efficient, and it's an efficient way to send money in a trustless nature. But to answer your question, if you think about transactions that you make currently with PayPal or Visa or MasterCard, right? The way those transactions are verified is from a proprietary network and proprietary infrastructure, and there's significant fees associated with that, right? A Bitcoin transaction, the mining, the distributed computers which I reference are the miners in the network that verify transactions. And the reward, as I said, for verifying a transaction is Bitcoin. So that's kind of a simple way to put how transactions are verified, juxtaposed to the way they are currently online.
Are you asking for a bit more of a technical background? Okay.
Not at all.
Could you explain the Dell transaction? Explain the Dell transaction. I want to buy something from Dell.
Yeah.
Too close to the technology.
Yeah.
Okay? So here, I go on the web.
Yep.
Okay, I like what I see.
I'll give it a try. So normally what would happen if I go to write a check from me to you, the valid transactional record of that is my bank. There's an independent trusted third party, i.e. a bank, that's there saying, we've kept a ledger of all the money that this guy's deposited and withdrawn over time, and so, yep, that check clears. So that's how we know that that transaction is valid. What blockchain has done, and what Bitcoin, the first implementation of blockchain has done, is that instead of a bank maintaining that ledger, the whole internet is maintaining that ledger. So when I go to give money from me to someone across the world, I'm able to do that by broadcasting it to the Bitcoin network, and then the Bitcoin network actually replays every transaction I've ever done, because each one of those miners has the complete copy of the ledger. It's got the whole ledger from the very start of Bitcoin. And then they can say, yep, this guy actually has enough money to send to this other person. So by taking that verification from the bank and putting it into the internet, it's much like when, I don't know if you guys remember Napster, and then the shortcoming with Napster was that you could always go to one server within Napster and shut it down. But then BitTorrent came along, and it was a distributed system for maintaining all of those torrents. So I call it the BitTorrent of money. It took a central point of control and spread it all over the internet. Does that help understand how the transaction works?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest transaction that we can have is I take out my cell phone, open up my Coinbase or Coin account or Zappo, and send him like Bitcoin through a link. I type in his address. I say, here, transfer him $10. It goes over to him, and he gets it. On the back end, this is there's a lot more complexity which is hidden. But at the most basic sense, I could just give him money through my cell phone, through essentially a text message.
go and purchase, you get a string. It's called hash, right?
I think a public key.
Yeah, and then you basically make sure no one gets your private key, and you store it in a place where it's not accessible unless you want to transact. And, there's been same like, you'd keep some money in your wallet, some in the bank. There's been thinking developed around that. Like maybe you keep some of that on your wallet and some in a vault. So it's not hackable. So there's some parallels to this, to your, there's no central system because this is the reason why this currency is born, so that no one entity can crush it and stop it. I think, what other questions I'm just trying
Yeah,
to.
so the question around, like, how do you use this on Dell or Overstock?
Yeah.
So I would argue that right now to use the Bitcoin infrastructure and to use a traditional Bitcoin wallet is not something that mainstream consumers are going to use because you have to worry about your public key and your private key. At Coinbase, what we do is take control of the private keys and give users a Coinbase account, which is your email address. So just like PayPal, you have an email address associated with your account, and you can receive money via email. And instead of dollars, it's Bitcoin, and it's, you benefit from all the efficiencies and everything else that we talked about. So if you go to Dell.com right now and you want to buy whatever it is you want to buy, right alongside a credit card or a PayPal account, you'll see Bitcoin. And if you want to pay with Bitcoin, you click the box, you're redirected to a Coinbase hosted payment page where you'll enter your Coinbase account and password and can check out in one click. And it's a really seamless consumer experience. If you're already logged in, you can, the two-click checkout, it's truly the most seamless experience that I've used on the web. And the convenience is something that I think will become more apparent to consumers over time. It's still not super easy to buy Bitcoin. It's not super easy to use, but as services like Coinbase continue to improve, I think that experience will improve as well.
That means in order for me to transact it, I have to buy Bitcoin with real dollar.
That's right.
And I have to have in my,
Yep.
therefore the guarantee is still US government if I'm using dollar. Because that's where the dollar value is coming from, the US Treasury.
Think of it as just another currency, so
Think of it as just another currency. So if you went and bought rupee or peso, it's traded the same way. So
I have a question. I get it, it's just like any other currency, and I understand about all transactions being tracked and, brokerless transactions and everything. But can you talk about the transformation? Like, today people are using green money, and tomorrow it's going to be Bitcoin. How will the Bitcoin transactions replace the paper money? Or will that be in parallel with your paper money transactions?
I'm not going to pretend to be able to answer that question completely. I do know some of the pieces that need to happen. One, I've talked a little bit about the last mile infrastructure, being able to just quickly get fiat into money at physical locations. So ATM machines is really what that comes down to. There's a bunch of efforts around Bitcoin ATMs propping up all over the world, especially in countries where the other end is a valuable remittance center, i.e. India, the Philippines, and Mexico. Also payroll, I mentioned another one, people being able to get their money with Bitcoin directly instead of having to convert it. Those are probably the two that would make the biggest difference for adoption in most countries.
Question. I can see the motivation of the governments why to use the Bitcoins or whatever the digital currencies. However, kind of the question is, has there been maybe any conversation that someone from the government would approach you and say, look at, why don't you support all of that? The government would issue the currency, the only ones. The government would regulate the currency, basically, and you would support the infrastructure of that.
I think that that takes away from a lot of what people love about Bitcoin. The reason I mentioned earlier that there's a really passionate user base of people that love to own and use Bitcoin, right? And it's because it's decentralized. It's not controlled by any central group of people. And the money supply is math-based. And anyone that wants to take control of their money can create a wallet and do that. And it's completely inclusive. And there's a lot of the benefits of Bitcoin, if you get a government involved, takes away from that. So, it's possible, and regulatory is very important to us at Coinbase. We, particularly in the U.S., we've talked to all the major regulatory bodies, and they're interested. And there's legislation going on right now, particularly in New York with the BIT license, and other states and governments across the world are interested in learning. But yeah, I don't think. I think that the real benefits of Bitcoin are the lack of a third party involved. That's my perspective. Yeah.
Sub-question is, will the governments be willing to give up the control over their currency?
That's who knows.
It's
Probably not.
It's kind of like the internet. Yeah, the government can create their own internal internet. I heard Iran's trying to do that, and Russia maybe in the near future as well. But it's the kind of case, the people who are on it, why would they use the government's internet when there's a global internet not controlled by the potentially corrupt government? And yeah, the government can probably try to stamp it out within its borders, make it illegal, but it's very difficult to do, and it really puts your populace off in a way that you don't want to do as a government.
There is one problem also. How do you convert the different currency to Bitcoin? Because in a regular world, with regular currency, this get traded with different way, the controls are there. Where is the...
So similar to any currency or commodity, right? There's markets across the world that enable you to trade it. And as I mentioned, Coinbase in the U.S., we're the easiest way for a consumer to buy Bitcoin. We have a market price that fluctuates, on a minute-by-minute basis. If you go to Google Finance or Bloomberg right now, the price that you'll see for the market in Bitcoin is the Coinbase price. And so yeah, it's volatile, it moves a lot, but it's traded like any other commodity or currency.
Let's move to other people on this side for questions.
In the back.
Yeah.
I have a question, because Bitcoin has a fixed amount that it will ever be generated. It has the die in itself, because people lost their private keys. Some of them will be lost with time. So the amount of Bitcoins will reduce with time.
Yep.
The tendency is only to reduce it.
Yep, so it's deflationary by nature, right, is what you're referring to, which this is an economic experiment. It's never really been attempted before, and it's different. It's a different monetary system and distributing money supply than that's ever been done. So I think it's a fair question and concern about Bitcoin, and it's unclear how exactly it's going to play out, but I think it's a pretty interesting economic experiment. That's all I'll say about that.
So a lot of currencies are not fully convertible. I can have very large sum of money in India, but Indian rupee is partially convertible. It means I cannot buy dollars or euros or pound from Indian rupees because of government regulation. Bitcoin allows me to transfer money from India to US in infinite amount. So of course, I know Bitcoin wallets and ATMs are opening in India and Philippines and everywhere, but a lot of these countries' currencies are not fully convertible. So government is going to come and, stop, because they are controlling the fluctuation of Indian rupee by controlling how much rupee can be converted. So how do you see that coming into wave, when someday Indian government says that, hey, everybody's buying too many dollars through Bitcoin, I'm gonna.
I mean, there might be friction there. There's been a long history of governments trying to peg currencies to certain aspects. Most famously, George Soros broke the Bank of England by colluding with other hedge funds to make the currency peg go away. I will say that, yes, while there is this reason for India not wanting to do it, they also have a reason that they do want to do it, because as you guys know, there are a lot of Indians in the U.S. who make a lot of money, and it does bring more money, more capital investment back into India without the usurious fees charged as remittances. No one wants to pay 10% of any money they transfer back to India. So yes, they might have to give up the currency peg, but this will allow a lot more foreign money to flow into India. So it's not as clear-cut an argument as you would think.
On a follow-up to the same question, because from US to India you can send as much, but India to US there's a limit. So there is a, yeah, both ways is not the same amount that's allowed.
So these types of currency controls are actually exactly what just played out in China over the last few months. People figured out that you could get around the currency controls of China that limit the average person from withdrawing up to $50,000 and use Bitcoin as a vehicle to get the money out. And then the Chinese government woke up, figured out that that's what people were doing. So they said, nope, we're not allowing any more Bitcoin. So there's no question that this is going to happen. There's no question there's going to be contention between governments. This boils back to the notion of control that you were bringing up. Why would a government want to give up this control? It's less obvious, again, to us here in the U.S., but take a country like Ecuador, for example, who's actually already using the U.S. dollar. They've already relinquished control. They say, well, we're not good at handling monetary policy. And then take defunct countries like Zimbabwe that have a lot of trouble. That's where it'll actually start from, where digital currencies will become the norm, is when there's less pain, less control, or it's already been given up, and then all these advantages will pile up over time.
So one question similar. If India has a problem and China has a problem, you've ruled out half the population of the world. How are you going to reach 1 billion people for Bitcoin?
People in China still transact in Bitcoin. I'm pretty sure India as well. It's the kind of thing where you can make certain things illegal, but that only pushes them to the black markets. It doesn't kill them entirely.
So I forget the name of the site, and maybe someone on the panel remembers, but there's a site where you can see where folks are purchasing Bitcoin globally, and it's heavily weighted towards China, and there hasn't been the effect that was hoped or supposed by the government.
Right, but that's
Yes.
the point I'm trying to make, that the killer app for Bitcoins is illegal transactions, period.
So I think, and by illegal transaction, you mean converting money against government will, I think.
It could be government related, it could be drugs, it could be whatever, but it's all about illegal transactions.
Well, no, so I would say it a little different. So I think the killer app is being able to transact without getting approval of a third party. So that can be, so any store of value should be, great at that. So art is also the killer application for high-priced art is, very similar. And as you see effective stores of value, you'll see the same.
And cash.
And cash, yeah.
And major portion of the money is illegal in India right now. So that can come out if this kind of control go off.
What is U.S. Treasury's attitude towards?
How is this going to get taxed?
I'll step on the landmine here. So, the leader of FinCEN got up in front of a congressional hearing about 6 months ago and was directly asked, will Bitcoin enable more terrorist activity, drugs, all of the right keywords that people are worried about? And the leader of FinCEN, and keep in mind, she's trying to be anti-Bitcoin. She's up there arguing for more budget so that she can get more money to go fight Bitcoin. And she even said, well, actually, no, the paper $100 bill is still the absolute best vehicle for money laundering and illegal activity because it's untraceable and untrackable. So I think I went through this phase where at first I thought that the government was just being clueless and they didn't know about the cool new technology. They're smarter than that. They know what's going on. I think they're looking towards a future where they can have a high level of traceability and accountability so that all of the activity can be tracked, taxed, and properly regulated.
One of the I'll add, there's a lot of innovations going on in digital currencies that make transactions even harder to track. Dark wallet is one of them, and there's many others. And so, we've had discussions with many regulators where they actually want, they believe in the future of digital currency. They want Bitcoin to be the one because it actually is easier to track than a lot of the others. And their concern is that, something like dark wallet or others take off, which would be even more, problematic for them.
Remember, Bitcoin is a pseudonymous, not truly anonymous way of transacting money. So every transaction on there is actually on a global ledger seen to everyone. Yes, it's difficult to de-anonymize that, but it's not impossible for the cases in which the FBI gets involved. And it's been shown, a lot of the people behind Silk Road got busted, and their Bitcoins were passed off to the federal government, which were later sold to Tim Draper, my boss. But yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. So how much discussion has there been with Bank of International Settlements or central bankers, or is that something they just don't get into at all?
I think it's, Ben Bernanke, last year, made a comment how he thought Bitcoin had long-term promise, but I think the reality is it's still very small compared to, most currencies in the world. And so I think they're kind of interested, but they view it as, something that's kind of cool, but not really on their radar yet, other than, cool to think about.
If the banks got smarter about fees and things like that, would Bitcoin be analogous to a prepaid credit card?
Can you explain?
So that's presuming that the number one benefit to Bitcoin is low transaction fees, but it's this lack of center point control that's actually the driving force behind Bitcoin.
So, so you're talking about traceability, and you said that Bitcoin has higher traceability. It's easy to kind of track, what transactions have taken place by identities. In the future, do you see that alternate digital currencies gain more traction in the underground just because they are less trackable?
Very possibly so.
Yeah, I think so.
The new Silk Road coin is a coin called Dogecoin, and I think it actually took over Litecoin as the number 2 in terms of market cap, because that's what it's being used for. It's untraceable, it's untrackable. They use a lot of technology to mix the coins to make it so that you can't follow it around anymore. So this is actually an interesting example of how the community has already reacted to a shortcoming that Bitcoin had and a hole. In the Bitcoin community, this is actually more referenced on a positive scale, not from a privacy, or it's privacy rather than untraceability. The argument is that the currency needs to be fungible, and that's important for 2 reasons. One, I need to be able to know that if I get Bitcoin, I can't later be prevented from using it because 12 steps ago it was used in a Silk Road transaction, for example. So they want to make sure that there's no tainting of the currency that's possible. And then also, if you think about getting paid in Bitcoin, then I go and I use that same wallet to buy something online. Somebody could reverse the transaction back up the chain and figure out how much my paycheck is. So there's simple privacy issues that the community has already got solutions to. They're called mixers that are helping prevent and obfuscate these transactions.
One last question, and then I think we're running out of time.
The fundamental difference between Visa and Bitcoin is that you have to have money to spend in Bitcoin, like you have to have in bank account, versus in Visa you are borrowing money and spending. So is there such concept of borrowing Bitcoins or
Credit.
getting
Credit,
interest?
yeah.
There's several companies working on Bitcoin-backed debit cards that would allow all of the functionality of a credit card, but it pulls from an existing wallet. Credit is a challenging one because of the inflationary nature of Bitcoin. In other words, you'd have to pay a lot more back later when you went to go pay it back.
There are other kinds of systems that are coming up that are equivalent to developing a FICO score for you. It may not be credit system, but it would be something else, or reputation for the user or the person transacting. So there, again, this is still very early, but there's a whole ecosystem of products that need to come up to, and we don't even know what that would be or that will be to make it usable to the point where we want to make it work. But is there something else I'm missing? One last question. And I said, oh, go ahead.
So I was just thinking that with Bitcoins, we would eliminate all the illegal, the black, the white money. It would be all one kind of money. But it looks like that's not going to happen. It will still, it will evolve to form the black money or the dark money, like you were talking about, the dark coins, right? So is there some way that you could have a future where you would have a transaction where all the money is all legal?
No, I think criminals are smart and they'll always figure out a way. But I do think a digital currency-backed world is harder for people to get away with that than a paper cash world. So, in the broadest of senses, I do think that crime will be harder to do with digital currencies.
So that's a wrap. Thank you very much. I'm so glad I have such smart friends. This was a tough audience, and you all took it very, very nicely. So thank you very much, and thank you for flying and driving from all these far places to make this happen. I appreciate it.